Hi, and welcome back to Glassboxed, writing automated Java tests using WebDriver. Today we're going to have a look at this concept of waiting. We'll look at, in general, what waiting is and why you would need to use waiting, and how to use waiting, and a couple of different ways in which you can actually implement methods to allow your script to wait for something to happen. So firstly, what is waiting? What is this idea of waiting? Well, in a script, sometimes you might come across an element not found exception, or in general your script might fail, not because the script is bad, but because the web element that you're trying to interact with was just not visible at that point in time. And that could happen for a whole host of reasons. The first primary reason is that your test was just simply trying to find something that just didn't exist, because your test was effectively running a lot faster than the web page. Usually that doesn't happen, but it could happen. For instance, let's just say you've got a lot of JavaScript loading in the background of your page. Your page, for all intents and purposes, has loaded fully, but the JavaScript is still running in the background, therefore some elements may not be visible yet, and as a result your script might fail. So there are various different types of conditions where you would need to basically tell your test to just kind of hang on for a second until something happens, and that's what we'll do today. We're going to look at two different methods that you can employ to try and get your script to wait for something to happen. So the first thing we're going to do is just navigate to the Java test site, and I'm going to really quickly describe the user journey we're going to test against and try and then write some waits for. So the journey we're going to automate is actually quite simple. All we're going to do is navigate to our test app, click on the contact. We're then going to fill in a few fields. We're going to fill in the name field, the address, postcode and email, and then click the send button. So let me just quickly populate these fields, and then when we're on this page we're just going to do some assertion. We'll probably just assert on the URL just to make sure it contains this contact confirm, nothing else. So to try and speed this video up, I've already done that. So if I open up Eclipse, here you can see that I have already written a test that basically opens up the web app, clicks on the contact link by getting the ID of that. So again, let's have a quick look. So that's got an ID with contact underscore link. If we click on the contacts, and we'll just look at one field, this has a name attribute with the value of name underscore field. So if we go back, we can see that we are getting the name to tag, or rather the name locator of each of those fields by name field, address, postcode and email, and just sending some test data to it. Finally, we're doing the same thing to the submit button for that form and clicking on submit, and then at the end, once we clicked on submit and assuming we've navigated to the page, i.e. the contact confirm page, we're just doing a quick assertion on the URL. So before we go any forward, let's just run this just to make sure it works. Okay, so looks like it worked without any issues. Okay, fantastic. So now let's have a look at the page, and this is probably a good page to be on for the moment anyway. How can we say force our test to wait? So again, this concept of waiting, well, we can do two things. The first method that is usually kind of put in place is to physically put in some kind of thread sleep method. What that means is you basically create a brand new thread and you put the thread to sleep, and as the thread is sleeping, it pretty much forces your test or script or any method that you use this thread sleep on to basically wait for X amount of seconds or a set amount of time. So we're going to try and do that. Now, why would we want to do that? So like I said, let's just assume that this page has a lot of JavaScript running on the background, or has something that runs in the background which stops certain web elements from rendering. When the page loads, for all intents and purposes, the DOM of this page would have loaded fully, and our test would run, but it might not find certain things. Let's just say the appearance of this form is strictly related to a lot of background information running. When the DOM loads, this stuff would have loaded on the DOM level. That's what WebDriver uses to locate elements. But from a physical aesthetic purpose of this page, these things might not have loaded. Hence why a script might return an error saying element not found. So one way of doing this is, like I said, you can try and invoke this waiting method. And the first waiting method we'd look at is this thread waiting method. So I'm just going to quickly write the methods inside the test. Ideally, you shouldn't really do this. What you should do is just open up or create a new package and create a utility class and do it all in there. But just to keep everything in one nice clean place, I'll do everything in the same test for the moment anyway. So the method I want to write should be able to wait for a set amount of time, and I should be able to set the time I want. So how can we do this? Well, what I tend to do is just write a public void wait method, which takes a number of seconds. So I'm just going to pass in an int seconds, and in this method I am going to create a new thread, or rather I'm just going to invoke the thread, and on the thread I'm just going to put it to sleep. I'm going to put it to sleep for seconds times by 1,000. So what's happening here? Well, I really don't want to kind of go into what threads are, because that is a very not complicated topic, but is a huge topic to cover, and it isn't strictly related to how WebDriver works as such. This is more of a Java concept really. But to break it down, or to rather provide a really basic explanation, whenever you run something, whenever you're running an application, whenever you're running a thread, whenever you're running something in Java, or to be more abstract about it, when you say compile something and then your application runs, what happens is it's running on what's called a thread, and it is on this thread that actions are performed. So you have the ability to create multiple threads, i.e. you can have, if you want, multiple applications running at the same time, if you are able to kind of cater for a scenario where you have multiple different threads. So if we understand this concept of when our test runs, it's running on a thread, then if you think about, hold on, we've got our test which is running on a thread, and now we create a new thread which is doing nothing but just waiting, then it should make a little bit more sense in that what we're doing is, if we were to speak in a hierarchy, or rather in a chronological order of things, our test runs, and then we call this method. This is running on its thread. We then call a method which creates a brand new thread, and what would then happen is this thread would kind of pause its current execution, whatever it happens to be doing at that point in time. Our new thread would start doing whatever it's doing. When it's finished, it will then effectively pass the control back over to whatever was running. So using this thread idea, i.e. using this idea of passing the buck to something else to do something, in this case it's doing nothing but waiting, will effectively force our test to wait. So going back to thread.sleep, all this is doing is basically getting an instance of thread and just putting it to sleep, i.e. it is as it literally sounds, it's not doing anything, it's just going to sleep. Now with threads you need to effectively encapsulate these without inside some kind of catch clause, inside error handling. Again, this is effectively not related strictly to WebDriver, and it's more of a Java concept, but the way you do it is quite simple. You just put in a try catch so what's happening here? Well, again, I don't want to go into too much information, but this is basically a method used where you have this method called a try catch, and in this try catch what you do is inside the try block, i.e. this block here, you try and do whatever you want to do, and there's a good chance these things or these actions you perform inside the try block might potentially throw an error, and then it is in this catch block that you try and catch the errors and try and handle them. So on the off chance, let's just say an error isn't handled, what would happen is your application would potentially explode. But if you have a try and catch and an error is thrown, your application could still potentially continue as normal, but the error would have been caught and handled, i.e. writing a try catch has the potential possibility of stopping your application from, say, crashing while still continuing with this process. Anyway, what we want to do is now use this wait method to actually force our test to wait for a moment. So let's just use it here. So here what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say wait, and I want it to wait for, let's just say, 5 seconds, and that's it. It's quite simple. So now if we run this test, what we're expecting is once we click on the contact link, we would expect the test to do nothing for 5 seconds and then suddenly start continuing with the test. So let's just run this just to make sure it works. So as you can see, it's now waiting here. Fantastic. So our test did actually wait for about 5 seconds after it had clicked on the contact link, proving that our wait method works. So this is a really rudimentary way of getting our test to wait for a set amount of time. But as some of you may have kind of pondered already, there's a huge disadvantage to this. The biggest is the fact that you are actually waiting for something to happen when something could have already happened. The problem with this method, or rather the problem with this approach, is that when we end up waiting for, say, a set amount of time, in our case is 5 seconds, that's what we're literally doing. We're waiting for 5 seconds. What happens if, say, the reason we're waiting for was kind of satisfied within a second, or the reason we're waiting for isn't satisfied for 10 seconds? This approach then doesn't cater for that. So let me explain. Let's just say, going back to our JavaScript example, the JavaScript for this page loaded within a second. That means we've just spent 4 seconds waiting for nothing to happen. Or let's just say our JavaScript took 10 seconds to load. We've waited for 5 seconds for something to happen, effectively wasting time, and then our test failed anyway. Taking this approach is a very drastic approach in that this really doesn't guarantee that the amount of time we're waiting for is the correct amount of time, or whether it's actually a sensible amount of time. On the plus side, this is a fairly easy approach to use. Anyway, let's move on. We're now going to take a look at another approach, a slightly more complex yet more suitable approach, especially to WebDriver. So this new method, what we wanted to do is to basically do the same thing the above wait method does, but wait for as long as required only. In other words, it's going to do pretty much what this method is doing, but it's only going to wait for as long as it needs to wait. No more, no less. So what can we do? Well, luckily, WebDriver provides us with this until method. This until method is a really clever method in that we can use it to explicitly check for something until something happens. It's almost like trying to combine this idea of waiting and an if condition, saying wait until something happens and then continue. So let me just go ahead and write this method out. So first of all, our method is going to return a web element, and I'm going to call this method wait for page until element is visible. And in this method I'm going to pass in a locator. Now what do I want to do here? Well, I said I want to return a web element, so let's do that. I'm going to return, and this is where it gets a bit clevery. I'm going to return a new WebDriver wait, and in this driver I'm going to pass in the instance of the driver, and I'm going to set a maximum wait time. So in this case I'm just going to say 5000. Really quickly, I think I missed this part. When you say in the thousands, these are referring to milliseconds. So 1000 milliseconds is a second. So here 5000 milliseconds is 5 seconds. So let's just continue, and this is where we're going to use the until method. Okay, so we had an issue. It was just I misselected what I wanted to select. It was visibility of element located. Anyway, so what is actually happening here? Well, here what I'm trying to do is to basically write a method that has a maximum wait time, in this case 5 seconds, but more specifically it is explicitly waiting until an element is physically visible on the page. And the element that's going to be visible on the page is something that I'm going to actually pass in. So the way to look at this method is, this method will effectively end up waiting for nth amount of seconds, and you can define however long you want. In fact, let's just say we actually fully add it in as a parameter, max seconds. What we can do now is basically say, I want to be able to wait until a page element is visible without continuing with the test, and I want to define the maximum amount of time I want to wait for it. And what this does is, or rather if we were to just concentrate here, this dot until method is basically a conditional method that will continue to continuously check for something until it is satisfied, taking into account our new WebDriver wait here. So here what we're saying is we're expecting some condition, i.e. this condition here, to be true within this amount of second, and if it is, it'll return the element to us. If it's false, then it will throw an issue. So how do we use this in the test? Well, it's actually quite simple. What we can do is, let's just say we use the method here. If we go back to effectively the first page, which is in this case, if we were to see where we are on the test, i.e. we've just navigated to the web app, that's effectively this page. We'll just put in a random, let's pick this sentence here and quickly do an assert on it, and inspect on it rather. So this is inside a paragraph tag, and nothing else on this page is on a paragraph tag. What we can say is we want to wait until this particular tag is visible. So here all we do is pass in by locator, in this case it'll be tag name, and obviously we need to provide the maximum wait time, so let's just say 5000. So now what's going to happen is this method is specifically going to wait up to 5 seconds until this is visible. If it is visible, it's going to continue immediately. It's not going to wait the full amount of time. If it isn't visible, it's going to continue to check until this amount of time, after which point it's going to throw an error. So again, let's just run the test just to make sure it still works. Okay, looks like our test worked fine. So if you now compare both these methods in relation to how we actually implemented these waits in our test, you can see a significantly big difference between how these two actually work, and more importantly the similarities between the two as well in relation to the results they provide. This wait, or this method here, allows us to wait for a set amount of time, but doesn't give us the advantage of being able to move on with the test, assuming that our condition has been satisfied well within the time, or knowing that we know our test will fail but we still end up waiting anyway. So these two conditions are basically a side effect of trying to use this method here. When we however switch our approach and use this type of method instead, i.e. we only wait for the amount of time we need to wait, no more no less, then it speeds up our test time, and at the same time it takes care of all of those situations where we might need to wait until something is visible, but we have no control over when it will be visible. The only limited control we have is deciding how long we want to wait until that thing or element is visible. So in this video, we've learnt this concept of waiting, and we've looked at two different approaches, and we've discussed the pros and cons of each approach and which is better for what kind of situation. Both of these approaches are definitely worth considering if you need to wait. You've just got to kind of weigh up which is better to use. And that's it for this video, folks. Thanks for watching. Hi guys, I really appreciate you watching my videos, and if you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you already haven't, hit the subscribe button below to stay up to date with my latest videos, which I release every Wednesdays and Sundays. Also, follow me on Twitter, Facebook and Google. Links in the description below. Until next time, ciao.